science,
engineering,
medicine,
chemistry,
physics,
biology, humanities, cardiology,
computing, public health, global
science communication.
Hello, I'm Gareth Mitchell. Today we report on the human leukemia virus. It can cause an untreatable form of leukemia and it's found all over the world, especially in some indigenous communities. The virus is relatively unknown, but one Imperial researcher says that dealing with it is a priority.
The most important thing by a long way at the moment is that it is still greatly under-recognised how common it is in certain parts of the world and how the disabling or fatal diseases that it causes still need an effective treatment.
And in this edition, we have another professor who cares deeply about people in some of the more disadvantaged parts of the world. As International Development Professor Sir Gordon Conway turns 80, he tells us why he still travels regularly to Africa to work with farmers on improving their livelihoods. And we have music and the planets.
The Imperial College Podcast.
OK, well, let's jump straight in with some news, and we're going to hear the latest about the psychedelic research group here at Imperial, and they've been looking at the links between ayahuasca and death, which is all pretty intriguing. Ryan O'Hare, you've been looking at all this, and you've been writing about it for our news website as well. So, Ryan, what do we need to know?
So DMT, or dimethyltryptamine, is the active compound in ayahuasca, which most people know as the psychedelic brew that's used in like shamanic ceremonies in South America. But it's a very potent psychedelic. And people who have taken it report things like hallucinations, out-of-body experiences, seeing bright lights, even experiencing changes to how they perceive time. What's really interesting is that obviously quite a few of these overlap with what people report when they have a near-death experience. And both sets of experiences can be quite profound and life-changing. So in the latest study led by Robin Carhart-Harris and Chris Timmerman, they carried out a small trial in 13 people. The participants were given DMT and then afterwards they were asked to complete a questionnaire relating to near-death experiences. And what they found is that those people who had taken DMT had similar scores to those who had had a real near-death experience. And this basically hints that they may have the same basis in the brain.
So that must lead into the wider significance of this research. This is giving us some real insights, not just into that particular compound, but the brain itself and how it's wired.
Yes, that's right. I mean, it's still really early days, and this was, as I said, it was a small study with just 13 people, but the team is hoping to explore things a bit further. What they think is that DMT could be used as a tool to help provide insights into what's going on in the brain during these really profound experiences. And more than that, it might even be able to help us better understand the psychological and the biological elements of dying.
OK, Ryan O'Hare, thank you so much for that. And we're going to hear more from Ryan in just a few moments. He's going to be telling us about the latest research on the human leukemia virus. But not before we've heard from James Ramiro. And James, always good this time of year to have a few dates to put in the calendar for the months ahead. And that's why you're here. Tell us what's going on.
Last week we launched a new series of public events that will be running through the 2018-19 academic year. We're calling it the Imperial Lates series. They're going to be after-hours evenings of discovery. We've been running what was known as the Imperial Fringe series for 6 years, I think, in the main entrance. And so from October onwards in 2018, we're sort of rebranding the series as the Lates evenings. They're going to be moved slightly later into the evening, focusing on maybe a bit more of an adult audience, still with all the sort of fun entertainment, fun areas of science and interesting discussions that made the Fringes so popular.
So what kinds of things can we look forward to in the Lates?
So we've got 5 that we announced. So the first one is looking at green technology and sustainable innovation, and that's the government are launching a Green GB week of sort of celebrating innovation in that area. So we're doing our part by looking at how technology and innovative ideas can solve climate change and environmental issues. In November, it's World Antibiotics Awareness Week. We're marking that with a look at infections generally. And then in December, we're doing a celebration of maths, a festive celebration of maths. And then in February, it's London Fashion Week, and we have never been part of it before. So we thought, why not look at wearable technologies?
Oh, like smart materials.
Smart materials.
Oh, brilliant.
Yeah, that side of things, and do our own fashion show. So maybe a sciencey fashion show during the week as well. And then we finish off the new series in March to mark International Women's Day with a look at both historical and current day sort of pioneering female researchers in science and engineering, and sort of the role of women in science generally.
Wow, what a programme that is. So how can people find out more and get registered for some of these events? Oh, and are they free like the Fringe used to be?
They're absolutely free. They're all going to be running from 6 till 9 p.m. If you type Imperial College and Lates into any common search engine, it seems to be the first thing that comes up. Or you can look for our new Imperial Lates Eventbrite page, which has all 5 of them listed, and you can register for 1, 2, 3, or all of them if you're interested.
Nice one. James, very much looking forward to the Lates in the months ahead. Thanks a lot.
No problem. Thank you.
Well, now, let's hear about a virus that causes cancer. This is the human leukemia virus. It's relatively unknown, but for a small proportion of people infected around the world, it can lead to an untreatable form of leukemia, or paralysis. Imperial researchers are studying the virus to learn more about how it infects our cells and hides from our immune system. The research is also helping to shed new light on its close cousin, HIV. Ryan O'Hare has been hearing more from Chair in Immunology, Professor Charles Bangham.
The human leukemia virus, which is also called HTLV1 for short, was discovered in 1980, just before the discovery of HIV. And in fact, the two viruses are closely related. They're both called retroviruses, which means that they integrate a copy of their genes into the DNA of the cell that's infected. And when the cell divides, it copies the virus genome along with its own genome, and that's how the virus persists in the body. That's why HIV and HTLV1 are so difficult to eradicate from the body.
And why is this virus a problem then?
In about 5% of people it infects. It causes an untreatable form of leukemia, where the average survival in the acute form is around 8 months, despite chemotherapy. The other type of disease that it causes is quite different. It's a chronic inflammatory disease, mainly of the central nervous system, and that culminates in paralysis of the legs. So, although it's somewhat related to HIV, the diseases that it causes are completely different. So the main places where it's common are in sub-Saharan Africa, Latin America, the Caribbean, and in southern Japan. And more recently, it's been realized that it's exceptionally common in some of the indigenous communities in Central Australia, sometimes more than 50% of adults. In Europe, it's much less common, but in France and the UK, it's quite common in certain groups that are descended from immigrants from the endemic regions, in particular the Caribbean.
And can HTLV1 be treated with the same sort of antiretroviral drugs that we give to patients with HIV?
The short answer is no. Whereas HIV seems to be constantly replicating throughout the time it's infecting someone, HTLV1 has a different strategy. It seems to remain mostly latent for a large part of the life cycle. That means that neither the immune system nor drugs can get hold of the virus and try to combat it. The main important question that we are trying to answer is what regulates this latency? In other words, what switches the virus on again when it needs to transmit either to another cell or to another individual?
So your recent study tried to unpick some of the background to this, how the virus acts once it invades the cells, and what did you find?
For a long time, it's been unclear how the virus results in leukemia. And one of the very odd features is that it typically causes leukemia in a small proportion of infected people, but only after about 50 or 60 years of infection. So it takes a very, very long time. So there's something about the very long-term persistence of the virus that leads to the malignancy. Like other retroviruses, HTLV1 can cause mutation of the host genome. What we've found is quite unexpected. Instead of activating genes immediately next door to the virus, it can also activate distant genes. We propose that this is likely to contribute to the cause of leukemia, because some of the activated genes that lie a long way may be so-called oncogenes, genes that drive the formation of leukemia.
So I guess most importantly, what do the findings mean for tackling the virus for this virus and for other retroviruses such as HIV?
This gives us a new perspective on how to try and control the virus, and it means that it is very likely to be difficult, if not impossible, to eradicate the virus from one host. That means we should focus on suppressing the activity of the virus rather than trying to eliminate all the infected cells. Secondly, it gives us new ideas about how the virus can cause leukemia.
So, Charles, you've obviously been working on this virus for a number of years here at Imperial. If you could sum everything up, a career in research, for one thing about this virus you'd like to tell people about, to communicate, the most important thing to you, what would it be?
The most important thing by a long way at the moment is that it is still greatly under-recognized how common it is in certain parts of the world, and how the disabling or fatal diseases that it causes still need an effective treatment. So it has very important implications both for public health and for basic understanding of science.
That's Charles Bangham talking to Ryan O'Hare. And staying on matters affecting people in some of the more disadvantaged parts of the world, let's hear about one of our remarkable development experts. Happy birthday, Sir Gordon Conway. He's Professor of International Development at Imperial Centre for Environmental Policy. Sir Gordon has just turned 80. A career that goes right back to the 1960s has taken Professor Conway all over the world. Well, one way he's been celebrating his birthday and his career, a career he has no intention of ending anytime soon, by the way, is by speaking to Andrew Szewski. And Andrew's been playing some clips from his interview to me and telling me more about Gordon and his work.
Well, he's certainly had an interesting career. He's led development institutes and scientific institutes, but he's always had that interest, that academic research interest in agriculture in developing countries, finding sustainable solutions to grow more crops, basically. And he told me about one region he's focusing on, particularly at the moment and over the last few years.
I'm focusing very much on agriculture in Africa, and in particular on achieving food security in Africa. I mean, the challenges are enormous. Over 200 million people who are chronically hungry. You've got imports of food of $40 billion a year into Africa. That's the sort of crude set of problems right now.
And he went on to emphasise that there's still actually a great proportion of children under 5 with stunted growth in Africa, and that's obviously a primary concern.
And when you spoke to Gordon, what did he tell you about his achievements, the things that really stick out most in his career?
Well, certainly he's got fond memories of Borneo in the 1960s. That was one of his first major posts there, and there he developed an integrated pest management program to solve the sort of disease problem there, and that solution has lasted for many, many decades. Also, the program of treating pregnant women in Africa with antiretrovirals, a simple solution to make sure that their babies don't get AIDS, basically.
Now, also one of Gordon's big research interests is in helping farmers, and especially when it comes to increasing crop yields, isn't it?
Yes, that's true. And one thing that really struck me speaking with Gordon was how he likes to listen to farmers, because after all, they know their land best and their crops best. And it's just really a case of trying to see where, certain hybrid crops and fertilizers can actually help and be appropriate in a certain agricultural region. So, yeah, it's a really collaborative effort with the farmers themselves.
Everywhere I go, I see farmers, maybe with a hectare of land or most 2 hectares of land. They grow maize. That's what they've done for years and years and years and years. If they have a hybrid maize with drought tolerance, and they also get a fertilizer mix that's appropriate for where they live, not just any old sack of fertilizer, but just for their soil, and maybe they correct something like boron deficiency or lime deficiency or whatever else it is, they can then get 4, 5, 6 tons per hectare. And you have to really think, just a farmer wakes up in the morning and he's looking out his field and planted it. He and his parents and grandparents and everybody else before, all the way back, over the centuries have only been getting less than a ton per hectare. And now he's getting 4, 5, 6 tons. And you can replicate that throughout Africa with the right kind of support and investments and so on and so forth.
Right, now, Andrew, Gordon is also really passionate about young entrepreneurship in Africa, isn't he?
Yeah, he certainly sees that as a way to sort of lift places that have had certain difficulties in the past, namely Rwanda, which was obviously ravaged by a genocide a few years ago, and now it's very much getting back on its feet. And part of that solution is a programme of sort of teaching 16, 17 and 18-year-olds. They get some training, they get a loan from the government bank. Gordon saw sort of dozens of them who formed a cooperative to sell potato seeds, for example. Many of these young entrepreneurs were setting up their own businesses. Gordon even went as far as to sort of compare that to sort of Silicon Valley in a way, that sort of, real, enterprising entrepreneurial vibe that's in the place at the moment.
So, Andrew, what are some of the places that have most captured Gordon's heart? Because he's been all over the world, hasn't he?
He certainly has, and certainly Borneo as a first posting where he went along with his wife, who's also involved in development. Northern Thailand, the sort of mountainous area of northern Thailand, he described as enchanting, and also Myanmar and Africa, certainly most recently.
Right, so Gordon is 80 years young, definitely. He's so young at heart. I've interviewed him as well, and he just has so much enthusiasm and zest for life. So did you even dare ask him if he's considering retiring at any point?
I'm not sure I did. I mean, he sort of brought that up himself, and he says he still finds the work very rewarding and exciting. And let's be honest, from his point of view, there's still much to achieve there. There's sort of populations who are malnourished. So, I think from his point of view, as long as he sees that challenge, he wants to rise to that challenge and sort of, help where he can with the sort of enormous, knowledge he's got to draw on. So yeah.
Yeah, and he's still travelling a lot, as he told you.
I go to Africa about every other month. I've been in Egypt and Rwanda recently, and I'm going to Malawi. We always get out into the field, sitting and talking to farmers. The classical situation is that you turn up in a village and they're waiting for you to do something, and then you start to break it all up. And for example, one of the things we did to begin with some years ago was to get villagers to draw a map of their village, but with chalk. And they would get so excited about mapping the village and the fields. And I remember one group of farmers, one village, and they'd actually gone and got soil from the individual fields. They'd become in charge, and you were now hearing this, and then they were hoping that you were going to be able to tell them something to solve some of the problems they've got. So all of that is very rewarding, and it's kind of privileged to listen to them and hear what they have to say. So I get a kick out of that. I have to say, I get a kick out of that.
That's Gordon Conway, who's been speaking to Andrew Krzyzewski. And by the way, Andrew's putting together a piece for Reporter based on that chat with Sir Gordon, so you can find out even more about his life and his ongoing work. Well, finally, an extraordinarily complex and clever suite. That's how one critic put it about a century ago, responding to Gustav Holst's now famous Planets orchestral suite. Well, now that suite has been revisited, and some of our Imperial scientists are involved, along with composer Deborah Pritchard, as Caroline Brogan now reports.
Just over 100 years ago, Gustav Holst wrote the Planets Suite, an all-encompassing musical study into the planets in our solar system. Now, to mark the centenary, Sound UK are recreating the suite with the London-based Ligeti Quartet, but there is one major difference in that we now have 100 years' worth of science to look to for inspiration. I spoke to Professor Philippa Mason and Professor Sanjeev Gupta from Imperial, who mentored the composers of the Planets 2018.
Holst's pieces were inspired by astrology, and this new suite, Planets 2018, is inspired by astronomy, by the science of the planets.
Deborah Pritchard is a composer working in London and around the UK. She also teaches at the University of Oxford, and she was approached by Sound UK to work with Sanjeev. Together, they're creating a new musical landscape of Mars that was previously unimagined by Holst.
Writing a new piece inspired by this idea is very different because we have all the science, we have all the facts and details, and can even see the landscape of Mars, which was just extraordinary to see for me as a composer.
How do you think science influenced your piece?
It was very important to see how Mars, the planet as it is now, is not this sort of raging turmoil of storms and winds in the way that Holst might have portrayed it, calling it the bringer of war. Mars, as I see it today, is actually much calmer, very majestic, it has a sense of history. So for me as a composer, to understand the science part of it and not to simply be influenced by the astrology means that the piece that I'm working on has that sense of depth and power that Holst had, but it also has a sense of stillness too.
Present-day Mars is very different. It's a sort of dead planet in some ways. Early Mars was warm and wet. There would have been rainstorms, snowstorms, and there was an episode in Mars where there would have been huge floods erupting and sending huge volumes of water across the surface.
What's Venus like musically?
If you listen to Holst's Venus, it's a very beautiful, sort of serene piece of music. It's Venus, the bringer of peace. The reality of the environment on Venus is slightly more unpleasant, a little hellish.
So in a way you've flipped the role of the planets.
Yes, Venus is a hellish place, and so it's a total swap from Mars.
How did they react to this? Is that what they expected?
Oh, no, they were really surprised, actually.
Yes.
Yeah. Deborah was really surprised by what she saw of Mars, and it's actually very Earth-like in some ways. If you go to a desert area of Mars, it's very Earth-like, but we don't have that for Venus, really, do we?
Not yet. We have some images which are from 1989 and at much larger scale, much more difficult to grasp what it might look like if you were able to stand there. I mean, that's one of the things we want to do in Venus, is to gain the same kind of imagery that we have of Mars now.
That report from Caroline Brogan. And that brings this edition of the podcast to an end. Just before I go, a quick reminder that you can catch up with everything that's going on around the college via our news website, imperial.ac.uk/news. And on Twitter, we are at Imperial Spark. Well, my name's Gareth Mitchell, and I'll see you in about a month's time. Looking forward to it already. Take care, folks. See you soon, and goodbye.